Hi everyone. Good evening, buenas noches, and thank you for tuning in. On behalf of all of us at the locally based, independently owned bookstore Books and Books in Miami, Florida, and in partnership with Miami Book Fair, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you to a virtual evening with William Alexander and Sara Echenique to discuss their books in the biography series Hispanic Stars, Celia Cruz and Roberto Clemente, published by our friends at Roaring Brook Press. Just a few things about these authors. William Alexander, also Will, is a National Book Award winning New York Times bestselling author. His novels include Goblin Secrets, Ambassador, and A Probably and Haunted Place. Additional honors include an Eleanor Cameron Award, an Earphones Award, 2 Junior Library Guild selections, 2 CBC Best Children's Book of the Year awards, an International Latino Book Award finalist, a Mythopoetic Award finalist, and a Sybils Award finalist. He now teaches at the Vermont College of Fine Arts program in writing for children and young adults. See his Cuban American pride with his latest biography on Celia Cruz. Sara Echenique is a Puerto Rican children's author and lawyer living in South Florida. Her children's books are heavily inspired by her pride in Puerto Rico, Puerto Ricans, and their culture, the same pride she hopes to instill in her own children. Her debut middle grade book, Hispanic Star, Roberto Clemente, is the first in a new line of Hispanic Star middle grade books aimed at highlighting some of our most important Latinx idols. Just a quick reminder that throughout this evening's broadcast, you can post questions below in the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of the screen. And please order your copies of Hispanic Star Celia Cruz and Hispanic Star Roberto Clemente from Books and Books and support independent bookstores. Enough of me talking, and now without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guests to the virtual stage.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Will.
Hey, Sara. Everybody. Welcome.
Nice to see you again. Welcome. Thanks to Books and Books for hosting us. Really excited to have you all here. So Will and I have been chatting about the best format for this, and we thought we might just have a conversation, ask each other questions, and at the end of this, hope you all have some questions for us too.
And let's get started. So I'm going to ask the first question. Sara, you described Roberto Enrique. Are you hearing an echo? I'm hearing an echo.
I hear you okay.
Okay, never mind. I'll ignore the echo. You described Roberto Enrique Clemente Walker as a man of quiet integrity and tremendous shyness. And he described himself by saying, I never was a big shot, and I never will be a big shot. That shyness and avoidance of the spotlight is a surprising trait in such a superstar athlete. Can you talk about that part of his character?
Sure. I think part of what makes Roberto such a compelling and interesting person is this exclusive to Roberto balance of his humility, his ability, so his talent, which was obviously monumental, and his personal pride. So he was so humble in ways that you wouldn't expect from someone in his position. He always helped what he called the common people. He identified with the common people often more than he identified with his teammates. One of his best friends in Pittsburgh was actually a postal worker, which is not really the kind of the typical community that you would expect of someone who's an internationally known athlete. His home in Puerto Rico was open to any and everyone. And I saw it firsthand in every source that I read, every person that I spoke with. We actually have a family friend whose parents lived on the same block as Roberto when he was already a known athlete and would come back to Puerto Rico when he was off of the Pittsburgh Pirates. And there's pictures where he's just kind of hanging out with them, just like any other person on the street, which is, again, is not what one would expect. He was always volunteering. He was always going to speak with the community. He wanted to be among what he would consider his people. And even after the Pittsburgh Pirates won the World Series, he was always focused on the fans and not his own personal glory. But then on the flip side, he was really, really proud. He knew almost from birth that he was deserving of respect, not just for his own talent and his innate abilities, which he actually did work really hard to get to the level that he got them to, but just for being a human being. And he was really frustrated with sports journalists and others during this era that seemingly on purpose would refuse to recognize his talents and they would kind of poke fun of him in the media. So they would write down what he was saying phonetically, trying to emphasize his accent and emphasize any grammatical errors. Whereas for other athletes who maybe were from the South or had accents or also made grammatical errors, they would fix them and try to make them sound more intelligent. So he was just really frustrated about that. So he has this delicate balance of, yes, he was humble and he had this incredible humility and purpose in serving others, but he was also really proud and commanded respect. And I think that's something that at the beginning of his career, he wasn't getting the respect he wanted, but by the end of it, he was at that level, thankfully. And I thought it was interesting for his wedding to Vera in 1964, his guest list kind of personifies, it was quintessential Roberto. It was, of course, his family, to whom he was so dedicated. It was his best friend, the postal clerk, and it was the governor of Puerto Rico, Luis Muñoz Marin. So it was really just every kind of level of society was someone that he could find something in common with and bring them to his level. But turning to you, anyone who's had the pleasure of reading Bill's book knows he does a fantastic job of incorporating music into a non-spoken or non-audio medium. And so I have to imagine that in writing this book about someone like Celia, you listen to a lot of music. So I'm curious to know, what was on your writing playlist? How did you incorporate music, and her music in particular, into telling her story in a form where the audience isn't able to have the benefit of her music?
Before I get to the playlist, there's one mentor text that I have to give a shout out to. It's called Listening in Detail, Performances of Cuban Music by Alexandra Vasquez. And that is just one of the best books about music that I've ever read. And it gave just an incredible vocabulary and perspective on talking about music and musical performance in these incredible audio experiences and visual experiences, and translating them into text and communicating not just the facts, but what it felt and what is conjured on stage in this overwhelming but ephemeral thing that, if you're not there, if you're not at the concert, then it's gone. And the way Vasquez described Celia in particular was a great model for just what's possible in this impossible job of translation, of communicating live performance into text. So that was a great guidebook right there. And then for my playlist, I tried to keep each chapter and each stage of her life. I tried to listen to the right music. So, the early music for the early part of her life. That was pretty much albums from the Sonora Matancera on shuffle. Her band, her group, her eventual husband, Pedro Knight, was a member. And so writing about the early years, and that itself was a weird translation, a weird act of translation, because the actual albums from that period were all destroyed. She was wiped from cubic memory, or attempted. They tried to, so all of those albums, all of that music, all of it was gone. I had to listen to the albums that she cut in exile from Mexico or from New York. I listened to so many different versions of Guantanamera because she sang it all the time. But then the really big deep dives into specific songs were Quimbara. It's the first track on Celia and Johnny. I had that on repeat just over and over and over again. And that book ended with her last song on her last album, Yo Viviré. It's an amazing cover of I Will Survive. And with the lyrics changed to be its own mini biography of Celia in and of itself. And so those two songs on those two albums were the things I listened to endlessly before and during their respective chapters, just playing in the background while I was trying to get down stuff about that part of her life. And the other thing,
I was just going to say, I could hear it in the background as I was reading it. So somehow you infused it into the chapters, was all I was going to say.
Oh, good. I'm so glad that worked. That was the goal. Yeah. And the other musical thread is the one that we share. Pregoneros, literally the voice of the street, the song of the city itself. Every street vendor hawking ice cream or fruit or whatever on a rolling cart. Everyone who's seen In the Heights. Miranda's character is singing a pregonero, is becoming the voice of the city itself while hawking things on the sidewalk. Talk about that for a sec before I ask more about history.
About pregoneros?
Yeah. How did they? Were you listening to them, or how did they work into the fabric of your crafting this book?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because obviously music wasn't as big a part of who Roberto was, but he was a musician, right? He played the harmonica when he was driving. He was a man with many more talents than I think people typically know. And he did grow up in Puerto Rico at a time where, right, pregoneros were very common. He had this experience when he went back to Nicaragua, right before he passed away, actually, that he felt like Nicaragua was almost like what Puerto Rico had been when he was growing up, where you have this really strong community feel of the pregoneros, although he doesn't necessarily call it that because, of course, he was speaking in English in a lot of the sources that I saw, and I don't know that those journalists would have even understood what he was talking about. It wasn't necessarily as common to their lived experience. But it is something that it just was so central to that experience of you're all listening to the same voice, talking about the same thing. It kind of unites you in a way that I don't know that we have necessarily anymore, at least not as commonly as we once did. I don't really remember listening to many pregoneros where I lived, but I do recall seeing them when I would go to Old San Juan and stuff like that. And it always felt like, oh, this is something that is meaningful to us and special, and not very many people will get to experience that, which is both sad and also makes you feel pretty good about where you're from.
Ditto. It was a surprise. I mean, sometimes I knew the songs, but then it's like, oh, that's why she's singing about produce in that.
Yeah.
I knew it as a track on the Celia album. I didn't know it as a street song. Okay, my actual question, next question for you is bigger. You briefly and so elegantly provide so much history and historical context for Roberto's life, both in Puerto Rico and in North America, from the legacies of colonization and slavery in the Caribbean, to Taino vocabulary, and the indigenous ancestry of the word bat in Spanish. I love that bit. So why broadly and specifically, why is the long view of history such an important part of telling the life story of a single person?
It's such an interesting question, and I wish that I could answer it fully, but I'm going to do the best that I can. But firstly, I think it's really funny because you and I weren't talking about our books as we wrote them, but we both included a fair amount of history and context, about the islands or the archipelagos, about what was going on in history, what their place in history was. And I think part of that is, you can't look at these stories or who they were in a vacuum. And our circumstances certainly don't define us. It didn't define them, but it has to have shaped them, and it did. Because so much of who we are, what we do, what they did, how they reacted to their circumstances really ends up defining us. I look at Roberto, who, when he went to spring training in Florida for the first time, was really encountering segregation, which was a form of racism that he had never experienced in Puerto Rico before. And he wasn't just okay with it. He wanted to change it. He wanted to do something about it. And that reaction ended up being a pretty defining moment for him and carried him through his whole push for civil rights through baseball, through his fame and through his abilities for the rest of his life, really. And I feel like us, in particular, being from Puerto Rico, so much of our history is intertwined in who we are, right? It's the sound of our music, it's the way that we dance, it's the taste of our food. So it feels impossible to tell a story about someone whose Puerto Ricanness is so central to who they were and how they lived without giving some background and context to it. And I hope that especially for some children who maybe aren't aware of it, whether they're Puerto Rican or not, this will be something that will help give them a little bit more idea as to just how challenging of a time it was to be who he was, right? Same with Celia. And to be as successful as they were in that world. And I know I wouldn't be who I am, if I hadn't grown up in Puerto Rico with my family, with my friends and our culture. And I know for sure that the same is true for Roberto. So thank you for that question. I don't know that I can fully do it justice, but I'll throw it right back at you. I mean, because I know you included this with Celia. What are your thoughts on that?
It felt impossible not to, and
Yeah.
which may be a non-answer. I mean, and which would be silly that I'd stumble over my own question that I'd thrown at you.
No.
But it felt like, how could you? How could you? And even something as fun and joyful as the way she's always shouting azúcar,
Yeah.
that she's shouting sugar all the time. Like that has history. Like that has an incredible and bloody history in Cuba. And it goes all the way back to Columbus's second voyage. Because sugarcane does not come from the Caribbean.
Right.
And so how it arrived and everything that followed. And Celia absolutely knew that history.
Mm-hmm.
So it would have felt icky and wrong, and like more of an act of censorship than omission, even to not allude to it, to not provide that context, to not have like, okay, let's take a moment to say, what does sugar mean to this plate? What is the weight of it? What is the joyous, exuberant, ridiculous amount in every cup of coffee? Absolutely blood-soaked history of just sugar. It had to be that.
No, I loved it. I had never really given any thought to it. I sang along to it, made sure my kids knew when the cues were there in the songs, but I never really thought about what it really meant. So that was great. So now to my actual question for you. So there's an incredibly wonderful segment of your book where you talk about salsa, so the music and the dance, of course, its origins, and then how Celia fit into all of that incredible history in the making. And at one point you quote Willie Colon, who's talking about salsa, and he calls it, "The music gave us mutual cause. It made us visible to each other." Which, first of all, was so striking to me to think about, right? It gives you that kind of common language. But tell us a little bit about this. How did Celia view her role in this? Was she even aware of it, or was it just kind of happening and she was living it?
Oh, she was absolutely aware of it, which she humbly downplayed a couple of times, but she knew, and she was always a force of community on every level. People didn't just bond with Celia; they bonded with each other in her company.
Mm-hmm.
She had a gravitational pull that created community and kinship and fellowship and common bonds wherever she went. And she very consciously, she would laugh and she would argue. I mean, Tito Puente hated the term salsa.
Yeah.
It's like, this is sauce. This is food. You eat it. You don't dance to it. What's going on? And he in particular really thought, like, these are distinct traditions. Everything is getting lost. So you're lumping it all together and claiming it's one thing, and it was never one thing. And Celia didn't disagree with that, but she found a way to honor each distinct tradition within the popularity of this new sort of catch-all label. And she made such a point of absolutely wherever she went. She toured all over the world, but all over Latin America, she would find the local songs and get the local musicians to come on stage and play the local traditional tunes with her. So she's bringing all of these traditions with this sense of shared Latinidad everywhere. But she's also uplifting whatever she found there, and getting all the great local musicians on stage with her. And it had this effect of basically giving everyone a solo. So nobody's disappearing into the chorus. Everybody, each distinct tradition and shout out to everywhere that she went got its time in the spotlight. And that was a very conscious choice to celebrate everyone, to keep them from getting lost in a sort of salsa melting pot. and that sort of diplomacy and ambassadorship and constant celebration was something that she did with every show. Very, very conscious.
You have so many wonderful moments where she's going through so much in her life, but when she expresses it in her music, it's always joyful, or almost always joyful, in a way that, I mean, feels impossible to do. So it does read like it was conscious, but it's just, anyways, I'm in awe of how she did it, basically, is what I was going for.
Ditto. Yeah. Lorena.
Yeah.
Okay, back at you. Speaking of spotlights, it's on you now, and so congratulations on your middle-grade debut.
Oh, thank you.
And your forthcoming picture book next year, Our Roof is Blue. It's a story about stories that helps kids navigate the aftermath of a hurricane. And you write for young audiences. And you described Roberto as someone similarly devoted to young people everywhere, particularly to the young people of Puerto Rico. So how does that, talk about that shared devotion? How did that devotion to young audiences, to young people, to telling stories to young people in different forms of media, how did that shared devotion become part of telling his story?
I think, it's a thought-provoking question. And I think for Roberto, I think it was pretty apparent that he knew that he was a role model, but not only he knew it, he actually embraced it. He wanted to be a role model for children, and for Latino children, and for children in poverty in particular. He wanted to provide them with an outlet for their dreams, to show this is possible. Look at what I'm doing with a little bit of talent. This is how he's viewing it, right? And a whole lot of grit and motivation and drive and hard work. Look at what you can accomplish. It is literally endless. There's no ceiling. And so he wanted to introduce them to that drive, that satisfaction, that self-discipline that he got out of playing baseball. And he didn't want their economic or their other circumstances to be a factor in whether they viewed that they could achieve those dreams. And so, he dreamt about opening up a sports city, La Ciudad Deportiva, for the Puerto Rican youth and their communities. So much of what he was doing was with that end goal in mind, was to lift up the youth of Puerto Rico and the youth in Latin America and the youth in the United States through sports, because that's what he was living, and that's where he was able to use that fame to his benefit. Like, he focused on children throughout his career. He stopped for all of his fans. He signed autographs. He chatted with them, but he was always really focused on the children. He would host youth baseball clinics. He had a sponsorship, right, from Eastern Airlines, where the payment was in baseball youth clinics. He didn't want money. He literally was doing this just for the children. And so he was telling his story to them through baseball, through these clinics, through this exposure. He was always wearing his Pittsburgh Pirates shirt, or jersey. I think I used the wrong terminology there, to show them, look at me, look at who I am, not just to be like, ooh, I'm the great Roberto Clemente, because that wasn't his attitude, but to show them this is a dream that you can achieve, and whatever your dream is, you can get there the way that I got here, which is hard work, dedication, and just always being centered and focused on who you are and respecting others and respecting yourself especially. And I think this was true even up until his death. With the earthquake hit in Nicaragua, he had been there just a few weeks before. And he, this internationally acclaimed, really well-known superstar, remembered a child that he had met in Nicaragua weeks before who needed a wheelchair. And so one of his first questions, one of the first things that he started looking out for was, how is that child doing? Did he make it? How can I help him? And so that was just central to who he was. And I feel like I would never compare myself to Roberto Clemente, but in the same way that I try to tell stories, my stories I try to infuse them with that same kind of pride in who we are, right? That orgullo about being Puerto Riqueño or being Latino or being whoever you are. And it's not ever downplayed. It's just, this is who we are, and that's the baseline. And then you kind of go from there, and you can tell your story, and it's not told from the perspective of, I don't know, I'm not sure where I was going, though, really mainly saying that it's told from a source of pride. And I think that really is the definition of Roberto. So in that sense, it was easy to tell his story. His story told itself because he was so vocal and external in telling that story through his sport. And kids are smart, they're perceptive, and they deserve to be told those stories in a way that they can understand it and then internalize it. And, they're our future, as silly as that sounds, it's true. So for you, you're a National Book Award winning writer among all these other incredible accolades, but you usually focus on, and you write unrealisms, to use your phrase. So, for example, your book, Goblin Secrets, it's about a boy who joins a theatrical troupe of goblins to find his missing brother. So, seems kind of different from telling Celia's story. So, just a little bit, how did telling Celia's story compare to your storytelling in your other books?
Luckily, it wasn't as different as I expected. I was nervous at first. Like, I had some stage fright. I when they asked me about writing this book, I don't write realism, so how can I presume to write nonfiction? Like, that's even more realism-y. But I do know how to write about the performing arts. I mean, my first book's about theatrical magic, and I know how to write about myth. And here's where I might get into trouble. I mean, here's where mi familia might get a little angry at me for, using the word myth in this context. But myths are founding stories. They're stories of who we are and where we came from. They're foundational stories. And the myth of exile is one that I grew up in. It's one that I came up just breathing. The Cuba of my childhood is a legendary place. It is the lost island of Atlantis. I know it is also an actual place, but that, like, the actual living, breathing place where people live, including, innumerable second and third cousins that I've never met. Like, that real place is not the same as the legend of Cuba Atlantis that I grew up hearing about. And Celia Cruz was and is a patron saint of exile in that story, in that, like, on a mythic level. And that's something I knew I could write about. Like, not necessarily about Cuba. I've never been to Cuba, but the myth of exile is something I could write about, and her role moving through the creation of that story. So that, that wasn't so different from writing fantasy, a queen in exile. Your turn. What have you been reading and writing lately?
So I have to preface this with, I have 3 young kids at home, so I read a lot of children's books. And with my 7-year-old, we're currently reading and then rereading and then rereading again her favorite graphic novels, which are basically, in Spanish, The Babysitter's Club and The Babysitter's Club Little Sisters, and then Reina Telgemeire's books like Smile and Guts and all of those. She loves them. I love them too, secretly. On my own time, I haven't been reading too much in recent weeks, but I did just get back from maternity leave. And so at 3 a.m., it was the perfect time to read books like Dial A for Aunties, super fabulous. The Thursday Murder Club, I enjoyed so much. My sister always has fantastic recommendations for me as well. But right now, in terms of what I'm writing, I'm kind of toying with a few ideas. Actually, maybe because I'm reading so many graphic novels with my 7-year-old, I'm kind of plotting out a graphic novel as well, and a story that I've been thinking about for a few years now. So it's always fun to fill any waking moment with even more work, but it doesn't feel like work. What about for you? What are you currently reading or writing?
Okay, you just reminded me of. So I'm going to add a third one now. I'm reading science fiction. There's a YA science fiction anthology that hasn't come out yet. It's about to come out, called Taste and Light. And full disclosure, I do have a story in there, but I get to read all the other stories early because I have an advanced copy, and that feels just cool to be backstage with the book itself. And the other stories in there are amazing. So YA science fiction. And 2 books about writing, since I also teach writing. Two particular favorites lately. One is Never Say You Can't Survive by Charlie Jane Anders. How to get through hard times by making up stories. There's a lot of how to get your book written in a pandemic. It's really good. And also, there's a favorite craft book. Though I have never written a comic, I love stealing narrative techniques from Scott McCloud's Making Comics, which is a comic about making comics. So if you're thinking about writing a graphic novel, this is pretty great.
No, that's fantastic. I'm going to go look that up right now, actually. Sophie, I think that's all we got for now. If we want to, I think we're good. We're good on time for questions, or.
Yeah. Okay. I absolutely love this discussion, guys. It was so entertaining. I actually had a few questions myself for you guys, if you don't mind. Well, obviously these people are super influential, and I'm sure there's endless amounts of information about them. So I just kind of wanted to know what the research process for this is like, and how you were able to turn that into more of a kid-friendly type of thing for children to understand it from that point of view.
Want to go ahead, Will?
Sure. I mean, there's a lot written about Celia. Lots in Spanish, lots in English, lots in translation. But the real gold mine, after reading a couple of books and talking to a few people, and then I found, it's unfortunately out of print, but she did have an autobiography that she dictated from the hospital at the very end of her life. Just a journalist friend visited her in the hospital, and they spent days just talking about her entire life and setting it all down in her words. And that retrospective from her own perspective, in her own words, was the gold mine. That was the perfect source to base most of this book on, most of the information in this book. And in terms of translating it to writing for children, I mean, there's a general principle as an educator and an author of book for kids, is that you can explain anything to kids. There's nothing that cannot be framed in a way that is both appropriate for and of interest to a young audience. It just requires a certain amount of grounding and memory of that perspective and respect for that perspective. And as long as, I mean, the one commandment is thou shalt not condescend. Like as long as you respect your audience and never talk down to them, then you'll probably do all right.
So I didn't have the benefit of an autobiography. I'm sure, as you know, right now, Roberto didn't even make it to 40. So he thought, and we all, I wasn't around, but people who were there thought that he was going to be around for a much longer time than we unfortunately had him. So I relied a lot on source materials from the era, which I quickly found were not very reliable, because they were colored with the perspective of, kind of what we talked about, right? They were not really speaking about him in a respectful manner, not really covering him in a respectful manner. So when I would go to the New York Times archives, it was fascinating, but it wasn't necessarily something that I could trust as truthful. And so I read a number of biographies, and then one that was written by his family as well, Beta and his 3 sons. It was kind of in a more conversational fashion that was really interesting, because they actually talk about some of the myths about him that are not factual, but have made it into source books about him. So I thought that was really helpful to figure out, okay, how can I pull apart this thread of this myth of this man who everyone knows, but do we really know? And figure out what was accurate and what was maybe not so accurate, more a reflection of the times. And then in terms of speaking to children, I think Will's exactly right. There's nothing you can't explain to children, and I have the benefit of living with children. And I have a niece and a nephew who are about the same age of the readership for this, as well as my own children. So I just spend a lot of time talking to them about these stories too, and figuring out what was going to be interesting to them. So my son was the first person to read this book, even before my editors. So he's a great audience. If anyone ever needs, send him an advanced reader copy. He'll be happy.
I love that. Thank you guys for answering. A couple questions from the audience. Lucas asked, what is one of the biggest things you admire about Celia?
Things I admire. Okay. So Sarah, you touched on this, actually, her sense of celebration, and her ability to celebrate and to default to just a celebratory mode, even under circumstances of tremendous pain, and even singing about things that wounded her very, very deeply. She had an amazing ability to celebrate, and that is incredible. I mean, she she sang a concert on a broken foot. She sang a concert like the night she found out that her mother died, and she was very, very close to her mother, and she couldn't go back to attend the funeral, which filled her with incandescent rage. And she goes on stage, and not just out of a sense of, I mean, the word duty is close, but an obligation, but something closer to fellowship, the bond between her and the crowd and the audience, and what they shared through the music that she brought to that stage. She didn't cancel shows for thunderstorms. She sang in the rain. She sang severely injured. She sang through immense heartbreak, and she always found a way to celebrate. And that's powerful. That's many stages more powerful than just, something nice and bland and always look on the bright side. Like, no. She, her ability to put a positive spin on things was so much more than spin. It was something that just seemed to alter the nature of the reality around her. And that's, I mean, you can't know anything about that, or have stood anywhere near it, or just have heard her sing and not admire that and just be in awe of it. So that above all else, and her sense of community, her ability to bring people together, in little ways and in huge hemisphere spanning ways, is and was tremendous, and is still happening many years after she died. So, Sarah, let's turn it to you.
I actually have a question from the audience.
Never mind.
Yes. What impact did Roberto Clemente have today?
So the question is, what impact he's had on Puerto Ricans today?
Yes. What do you think?
I don't even know that I can fully answer that question, because it's so monumental. I mean, just the fact that a person who was born, I won't say how many years after he passed away, I knew about him from my early childhood. When I was in the 4th grade, Vera, his wife, came to our school and talked about him. So he was just someone that was a part of our culture, even if he wasn't physically present. He's someone you talked about in terms of, look at how great we can be. Look at how great a Puerto Rican can be, regardless of the adversity that they're facing. And it wasn't just, I'm not good at sports. That wasn't what I looked up to him for, but just the fact that he was able to do what he did in a sport that was so unfriendly to him and to people who looked like him and to people who sounded like him, was really just, it's something that colors everything that we do even today. I mean, if you listen to music, part of my playlist were songs that talk about him, or that mention him, and talk about an número 21, so his number 21 that was on his jersey. And so I don't think there is a way to quantify the effect that he's had, just to know that it continues to be an effect today. Even just a couple of years ago, a school in Florida changed their name to the Roberto Clemente Elementary School. That's, to me, seems almost unheard of, that someone who lived relatively long ago, who passed so young, who played a sport that maybe not everyone is into, is continuing to have people remember him and look to him as someone that you want to emulate, because he was such a humanitarian. He was so good at what he did, and he was such a humble person, and proud of where he came from, proud of who he was, that it's someone that I think everyone who's from Puerto Rico, who knows about him, wants to instill that in the work that they're doing, right? I don't play sports, but I want to instill that into what I'm doing, both through my practice and also through writing of stories. So I don't know that that's a full enough answer, because I can't measure the impact that he's had, just that it continues to be something that we feel today.
Well, it was a great answer. Did you still want to ask that question, Will, or?
Oh no, that was great. I was going to turn the question aimed at me towards Sara and about Roberto, and pretty much covered it there. Yeah.
Okay, well, I think that's all we have for today. So I'll go ahead and do the outro. Well, Sara, thank you so much for the discussion. I really enjoyed it. I really hope everyone viewing learned as much as I did. So yeah, just thank you so much. On behalf of Books and Books, I really want to thank the viewers for joining. Do not forget to check out this series, Hispanic Stars, specifically Celia Cruz and Roberto Clemente. And I hope everyone has a good night, and remember to support independent bookstores. So yeah, thank you guys so much for joining. I'm gonna go ahead and end the broadcast. Sorry.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.